Julian Reyes had rehearsed the proposal for 3 weeks. A rooftop in the city, string lights, a ring his grandmother had left him wrapped in black velvet. He knelt down in front of Elena Voss, his fiancée of 2 years, and opened the box. She didn't cry. She didn't smile either. "Julian," she said, stepping back like the ring itself had burned her. "I can't do this anymore." He stayed frozen, one knee on cold concrete, the city lights blinking behind her like they were laughing at him. "I met someone," she continued, voice flat, rehearsed in its own way. "Victor Kane. Julian, he's someone. He owns half the skyline you're staring at right now." "What do you own?" "A laptop and a dream." Julian didn't know what hurt more, the words, or how easily she said them. What Elena didn't know, what she had never once bothered to ask in 2 years, was that Julian Reyes was the founder of Meridian Holdings, a private investment fund with more capital under management than most of Victor Kane's publicly traded empire. He worked from a modest apartment. No entourage, no yacht, no name on any building. Anonymity was his strategy. He'd built his fortune by staying invisible, buying quietly, and letting louder men make noise while he made money. He had never told her. Partly out of principle, he wanted to be loved for himself. Partly because he liked that she saw him as ordinary. Now that ordinary wasn't enough for her. The silence he'd built his life around felt like the cruelest joke of all. "Say something," Elena demanded. Julian closed the ring box. "Congratulations," he said quietly, and walked away. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He already knew what came next, not for her, but for him. That night, in his apartment that looked like a graduate student's, not a billionaire's, Julian opened his laptop. 3 monitors lit up with numbers, portfolios, shell companies. Meridian Holdings had a position in 11 publicly traded firms. One of them, quietly, through 4 layers of holding companies, was Kane Global Industries. Victor Kane's empire. Julian had never used that position for anything personal. Business was business. But as he stared at the ticker symbol glowing green on his screen, something cold and clear settled into his chest. Not rage. Rage was loud, and Julian had built his entire life around not being loud. This was quieter, colder, more permanent. He picked up his phone and called his lead analyst, Priya Nandan, at 11:47 p.m. "I need everything on Kane Global's Q3 debt structure," he said. "Tonight." "Julian, it's almost midnight." "Tonight, Priya." There was a pause on the line, then the sound of a keyboard. "You never work this late unless something's wrong." "Nothing's wrong," Julian said, watching the skyline outside his window. Somewhere out there, Elena was probably already telling Victor the story of the poor boy who proposed with his grandmother's ring. Something's about to be corrected. He hung up and stared at the numbers again. Kane Global was leveraged more than the public knew. Victor Kane's empire looked like marble from the outside, but underneath, in the numbers only a handful of people could actually read, it was closer to glass. Julian had spent his whole life avoiding the spotlight. Tonight, for the first time, he considered stepping toward it. Not to be seen, but to make sure that when the glass finally cracked, he would be the only one who understood exactly where to press. Meridian Holdings occupied the top 2 floors of a building with no sign on the door. Julian preferred it that way. Inside, however, it ran with the precision of a machine built by someone who trusted numbers more than people. Priya Nandan was waiting for him at 7 a.m. sharp, a printed report in hand, dark circles under her eyes from the all-nighter he'd assigned her. "Kane Global's debt-to-equity ratio is worse than what's public," she said, sliding the folder across the table. "They took on a massive loan 18 months ago to fund the acquisition of Sterling Retail. If their Q4 earnings miss even slightly, the covenant triggers kick in. Banks could call the loans." Julian scanned the numbers without expression. "Who holds the debt?" "3 institutions. We already have a position with one of them through Meridian's fixed income arm." He allowed himself the smallest smile. "Of course we do." Priya studied him carefully. She had worked for Julian for 6 years and had never seen this particular look on his face. Not during the 2019 market correction, not during the acquisition battles that made other investors sweat through their suits. This was different. This was personal, wrapped carefully in professional language. "This is about her, isn't it?" Priya said. Not a question, Julian didn't answer right away. He walked to the window, looking down at the city where somewhere Elena was probably trying on a life she thought she'd upgraded into. She called me nothing, Julian said finally. Said I own a laptop and a dream. You own 40% of the fixed income desk that's currently sitting on Kane Global's private debt, Priya said dryly. That's a very expensive dream. She doesn't know that. Nobody does. That's the point. Julian turned back to face her. I'm not doing this out of heartbreak, Priya. I'm doing this because Victor Kane has been over-leveraged and overconfident for 2 years, and eventually someone was going to correct that imbalance. I'm simply choosing to be the one holding the pen when it happens. It was a careful lie, the kind Julian told himself so easily it barely registered as one. Over the following days, Meridian quietly increased its position in the debt instruments tied to Kane Global. Nothing illegal, nothing traceable to any personal motive, just calculated accumulation, the same strategy Julian had used 100 times before on companies he had never met the owners of. Except this time, every acquisition felt different. Every signed order felt like a small, silent step toward a door he hadn't planned on opening. Elena, meanwhile, was living a life photographed for social media. Julian saw the posts. He didn't seek them out, but algorithms had their own cruelty. Elena at a gala in a red gown standing beside Victor Kane, tall, silver-haired, radiating the kind of confidence that came from decades of being told he was untouchable. The caption read, "Finally, a man who matches my ambition." Julian closed the app and set the phone face down. Priya knocked and entered without waiting. The board is planning to announce a new investment round to shore up liquidity. Word is they're bringing in outside capital to strengthen the balance sheet before the debt covenant deadline. How much are they raising? 200 million. Julian nodded slowly. A plan already forming with the quiet inevitability of a chess move considered 3 turns in advance. Find out who's leading that round, he said. And Priya, make sure Meridian gets a seat at that table. Anonymously, of course. You want to invest in the company that's about to save Victor Kane? Julian's expression didn't change. I want to be in the room when it decides whether it needs saving at all. Elena Voss had always wanted more. Not more love, more proof. Proof that she had escaped the ordinary life she grew up watching her mother struggle through. Waitressing double shifts while her father drifted between jobs and excuses. Victor Kane gave her proof in the form of marble floors and a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. He gave her a black card with no limit and a driver named Frank who called her Ms. Voss, with a respect that felt to her like finally being seen. What Victor didn't give her was time. 3 months into their relationship, she'd learned his schedule better than her own. Board meetings, investor calls, dinners with men who spoke in numbers she only half understood. She sat beside him at those dinners, smiling, nodding, occasionally offering an opinion that Victor would acknowledge with a distracted, interesting, before turning back to men in better suits than her father ever owned. Tonight was another one of those dinners. A private room at Le Meridian for other executives, and a man Victor introduced only as one of our new capital partners, who sat quietly at the end of the table, barely speaking, watching everything. Elena barely glanced at him. He wore an ordinary gray suit among a room of Italian tailoring, and he kept his eyes down on his plate more than on the conversation. Forgettable, she thought, the way she thought about most of Victor's business associates. The new investment round should stabilize the balance sheet through Q1. Victor was saying, swirling wine he didn't seem to actually enjoy. Once Sterling retail integration is complete, we'll be looking at record numbers. And if the integration underperforms? Asked the quiet man in gray. The table went briefly silent. Victor's smile tightened, just slightly. It won't. Confidence is good, the quiet man said, setting down his fork with deliberate precision. But covenants don't care about confidence. They care about numbers. Elena watched Victor's jaw flex, an expression she recognized from private moments he thought no one else saw. Moments where the marble floor confidence cracked just slightly at the edges. She found herself, for the first time all evening, actually looking at the quiet man. Something about the calm certainty in his voice was familiar in a way she couldn't place, though she brushed the feeling aside. I appreciate the diligence, Victor said, recovering his smile. That's exactly why we brought Meridian's capital in. careful people asking hard questions. Meridian. The word passed through Elena without meaning, a name among 100 other names in Victor's world of holding companies and investment vehicles. Later that night, back in the penthouse, Elena stood at the window looking down at the city. Somewhere down there, she thought, was the life she used to have. Small apartment, modest dinners, a man who used to look at her like she was the entire skyline instead of just another dinner guest. She hadn't thought about Julian in weeks. Now, unexpectedly, his face surfaced, the quiet way he used to watch her across a room, saying nothing, understanding everything. She shook the thought away. Julian owned a laptop and a dream. This, the marble, the harbor view, the black card, this was real. She just didn't yet understand how much of it was standing on borrowed ground, quietly being purchased out from underneath her by the very man whose ring she'd once turned down. Meridian Holdings' involvement in Kane Global's capital raise was structured through a fund called Ashcombe Partners, one of 11 shell entities Julian used specifically to keep his name out of any transaction that might draw attention. Victor Kane's team had done their diligence, of course, but Ashcombe's paperwork led back through a chain of Delaware LLCs that would take a forensic accountant weeks to untangle. And even then, they'd find only Priya Nandan's name as managing director, never Julian's. Julian preferred it that way. He always had. But sitting in board meetings now, watching Victor Kane perform confidence for a room of investors who were quietly getting nervous about the sterling retail numbers, Julian found himself paying closer attention than the situation strictly required. The integration timeline has been extended by 2 quarters, Victor admitted at the next meeting, the polish in his voice thinner than before. Supply chain complications. Nothing the team can't manage. Julian said nothing. He didn't need to. The numbers would speak for themselves soon enough. And numbers, unlike people, never lied to make themselves feel better. After the meeting, Priya caught him in the hallway. The covenant deadline is in 6 weeks. If Sterling Retail's integration costs come in the way our models predict, Kane Global breaches the debt covenant regardless of the new capital round. And when that happens, the banks can call the loans immediately. Kane Global would need emergency refinancing within days, or risk of forced restructuring. Priya paused. Meridian, through Ashcombe, would be one of the largest debt holders in that restructuring. We'd essentially have veto power over the terms. Julian absorbed this the way he absorbed all information, quietly, without visible reaction. How much of Kane's personal wealth is tied up in company stock? Almost all of it. He took a personal loan against his shares last year to fund a lifestyle upgrade. Yacht, 2 properties, and Priya hesitated. And a very expensive engagement ring, according to the filings. 6 weeks ago, Julian felt something settle in his chest, cold and precise. Victor Kane had built a life on leverage in every sense of the word, financial and personal. He had taken Elena the same way he took everything else, aggressively, publicly, without fully accounting for the cost. Prepare the restructuring terms, Julian said. I want every scenario modeled. If the covenant breaches, I want Meridian positioned to control the outcome, not just profit from it. Julian, Priya's voice carried a warning. This isn't a hostile takeover of some faceless conglomerate. If Kane Global breaches and restructures under our terms, Victor Kane could lose control of his own company. His name is on that building. I'm aware. Is this still business? Julian looked out the hallway window at the skyline. Kane Tower rising gold and confident against the evening sky, a monument to a man who had never once considered that quiet things could be dangerous. It was always business, Julian said. Victor Kane just doesn't know yet that the game already changed. That night, Julian drafted an internal memo outlining Meridian's contingency plan for a Kane Global restructuring. Terms that would strip Victor of majority board control while technically keeping the company solvent. It was, by every professional measure, an aggressive but defensible strategy. It was also, Julian knew as he signed off on the final draft at 2 a.m., the most personal decision he had ever disguised as a professional one. The first crack appeared publicly on a Tuesday morning. Kane Global's stock dropped 6% after a leaked internal report suggested Sterling Retail's integration costs had ballooned 30% over projections. Financial news anchors speculated about operational challenges. Analysts downgraded their ratings. Victor Kane's PR team scrambled to control a narrative that was quickly slipping out of their hands. Elena watched it unfold from the penthouse, Victor's phone buzzing constantly on the marble kitchen counter while he paced the length of the living room, speaking in the clipped, controlled voice he used only when something genuinely frightened him. "I don't care what the board thinks," Victor snapped into the phone. "We stabilize before Friday, or the whole quarter is a write-off." Elena had never seen him like this. The confidence that had first drawn her to him, the marble floor certainty, had thinned into something brittle. When he finally hung up, he stood at the window for a long moment before turning to her. "Everything all right?" she asked carefully. "It's handled," Victor said, though his voice suggested otherwise. "Just noise. The market overreacts to everything." But it wasn't just noise, and Elena, despite not fully understanding the mechanics of debt covenants and capital structures, understood people well enough to know fear when she saw it. That evening, at a dinner, Victor insisted on attending despite the chaos. Appearances mattered, he always said. Elena found herself again seated near the quiet man in the gray suit. Ashcombe Partners, she'd learned his fund was called, though she still didn't know his name. He seemed to prefer it that way, speaking only when necessary, watching everything with an attention that unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. "You don't say much," she said, more out of nervous energy than genuine curiosity. "I find most rooms say enough on their own," he replied, not unkindly. Something in the phrasing struck her, familiar in its dry precision, the way certain people had of saying exactly what they meant without decoration. She studied his face for a moment, something tugging at the edge of memory, before Victor's raised voice down the table pulled her attention away. "The board wants answers by Friday," one executive was saying, "and Meridian's position gives them significant leverage in how those terms get decided. Meridian will act in the best interest of a stable outcome," the quiet man said simply. Victor's smile was strained. "Meridian has been a good partner. We intend to remain one," the man said. "Under the right terms." Elena noticed something in Victor's expression she'd never seen before. Not toward her, not toward the board, not toward anyone. It was something close to fear, carefully hidden but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. For the first time since she'd met him, Elena Voss began to wonder if the marble floors beneath her were as solid as they looked. The emergency board meeting was called for Friday morning, exactly as Priya had predicted 6 weeks earlier. Kane Global had breached its debt covenant overnight when Q3 earnings, released early to get ahead of further leaks, confirmed what the market had already priced in. Sterling Retail's integration had failed to meet even the revised projections. Julian sat at the far end of the table, the same seat he'd occupied at every meeting since Ashcombe Partners joined the capital round. Today, however, the room's attention gravitated toward him differently. Word had spread quickly through the finance world that Ashcombe, and by extension, the mysterious Meridian fund behind it, now held enough of Kane Global's distressed debt to significantly influence any restructuring terms. Victor Kane stood at the head of the table, and for the first time since Julian had met him, he looked his age. The silver hair that had always seemed distinguished now looked simply tired. "We have a path forward," Victor said, addressing the room, though his eyes kept flicking toward Julian. "A restructuring plan that protects jobs, protects shareholders, and stabilizes the company within 2 quarters. At what cost to existing equity holders?" asked one of the bank representatives. "Dilution, certainly, but manageable." "Mr. Kane," Julian said, his voice quiet enough that the room instinctively leaned in to hear it. "With respect, the numbers suggest something more significant than dilution." Victor's jaw tightened. "And Ashcombe's position is?" Julian opened the folder in front of him. Not because he needed the numbers, he'd long since memorized them, but because ritual mattered in rooms like this. "Meridian, through Ashcombe, is prepared to lead the restructuring on terms that convert a significant portion of outstanding debt into equity. This stabilizes the balance sheet immediately and removes the risk of forced liquidation." "That's generous," Victor said carefully. "It's practical," Julian corrected. "The terms would require restructured board governance, a majority independent board, with Meridian holding effective control given our converted equity position." The room went silent. Victor understood immediately what was being said beneath the careful corporate language. He would keep his name on the building, his title, his office. But he would no longer control the company that bore his name. "You're asking me to hand over my company," Victor said, quieter now, the performance finally cracking. "I'm offering you a company that still exists in 6 months," Julian said. "The alternative, as your own CFO's numbers confirm, is forced liquidation and a bankruptcy filing within 90 days. I'd encourage the board to review both scenarios carefully." Julian closed the folder and looked directly at Victor Kane for the first time all meeting. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the flat, unreadable calm of a man who had spent years learning to feel everything privately and show nothing publicly. "The board will vote within the week," the chairman said, breaking the silence. "Thank you, gentlemen." As the meeting dispersed, Victor caught Julian near the elevator, his voice low, controlled fury beneath the words. "Who are you really? Meridian didn't exist 18 months ago. Nobody knows anything about your fund." "I prefer it that way," Julian said simply. "This is personal," Victor said. "I don't know how, but I know it is." Julian stepped into the elevator, and as the doors began to close, he allowed himself, finally, a small and private smile. "Everything is personal, Mr. Kane," he said. "You just weren't paying attention to whose." The news broke publicly on Monday. Kane Global Industries would undergo a board restructuring following a debt-to-equity conversion led by an investment fund called Meridian Holdings. Financial journalists scrambled to identify the fund's principals. Most articles noted only that Meridian was notoriously private, its ownership structure obscured through multiple holding entities, its founder unnamed in any public filing. Elena read the articles standing in the kitchen, coffee going cold in her hands, while Victor took call after call in his office down the hall, his voice rising in ways she'd never heard before. She should have felt sympathy. Instead, she felt something closer to unease, a slow, uncoiling dread that had been building since that dinner at Le Meridian. Since the quiet man's dry, familiar phrasing had first snagged something in her memory. She opened her laptop and searched Meridian Holdings' founder. Nothing came up beyond the same vague references the news articles already carried. She tried Meridian Holdings Julian, on a hunch she couldn't fully explain to herself, some instinct half-formed and unwelcome. Nothing direct, but 3 links down, a photo from an industry charity gala 2 years earlier, a grainy background shot where a man in a gray suit stood slightly out of focus near a check presentation podium, a caption identifying the honored donor only as a representative from Meridian Holdings. She zoomed in. The coffee cup slipped from her hand and shattered against the marble floor. It was him, Julian. Her Julian. The man who used to make her coffee in a chipped mug because he said the good ones were for guests. The man who proposed on a rooftop with his grandmother's ring. The man she had told, without hesitation, that he owned nothing but a laptop and a dream. He had owned Meridian Holdings the entire time. He had owned, quite possibly, a piece of the company that now employed the very man she'd left him for. Victor appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of breaking porcelain. "Elena?" "What?" "Julian," she said, still staring at the screen, voice barely above a whisper. "Julian Reyes. He's Meridian." Victor's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, then dawning horror. Then something colder as the pieces assembled themselves behind his eyes. "Your ex-fiancé." "I didn't know," Elena said, and it was true, and somehow that truth felt worse than a lie would have. "I swear to you, I didn't know. He targeted my company." Victor's voice had gone very quiet, very controlled. The voice Elena now understood was his most dangerous register. This whole restructuring, this wasn't business. This was revenge. Elena stared at the photo on her screen, at Julian's slightly out-of-focus face, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not vindication, not anger, but a strange, hollow grief for a version of her own life that she now understood she had thrown away without ever actually seeing clearly. "He never told me," she said again, quieter this time, almost to herself. "Would it have mattered?" Victor asked, and the question hung in the kitchen air, like an accusation aimed at both of them at once. Elena didn't answer. She wasn't sure anymore, that she liked what her honest answer would have been. Elena called Julian's office 4 times before Priya finally put the call through, mostly out of curiosity about what a distressed ex-fiancé of the newly humbled Victor Kane might have to say. "Julian," Elena said when he finally answered, her voice tighter than she intended. "We need to talk." "Do we?" His voice was calm, unreadable, nothing like the version of him she remembered, open, warm, occasionally clumsy with his own feelings. This Julian sounded like the man from the dinner table, controlled and precise. "You knew," she said. "This whole time, while we were together, you were sitting on a fortune, and you let me believe—" "I let you see me," Julian corrected quietly. "I never lied about who I was. I simply didn't lead with a number, because I wanted to know if you'd have stayed without one." The words landed harder than she expected. She had no response that didn't sound like an excuse. "Is this revenge?" she asked instead. "The restructuring. Victor's company. Is this about me?" There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Elena wondered if he'd hung up. "Victor Kane built an empire on the same principle you valued when you left me," Julian finally said. "Loud confidence, borrowed money, appearances mismatched with substance. That imbalance was always going to correct itself, Elena, with or without you in the picture. I simply chose not to look away when the opportunity to correct it arrived." "That's not an answer." "It's the only honest one I have," Julian said. "Was some part of it personal?" "Yes. I won't pretend otherwise. But I didn't destroy anything that wasn't already standing on a foundation it couldn't support. I just made sure I understood the numbers before anyone else did. That's not revenge, Elena. That's the job I've done quietly for a decade." Elena closed her eyes, the penthouse suddenly feeling less like a triumph and more like a stage set that had just lost its backdrop. "What happens to Victor?" "He keeps his title, his salary, his office," Julian said. "He simply no longer controls the decisions that matter. In many ways, it's a mercy. The alternative was bankruptcy and the total loss of everything he's built, including his personal wealth. And me." Another pause, softer this time. "You're not a line item in a restructuring agreement, Elena. What happens to you was never part of my calculation, and honestly, it still isn't." The words weren't cruel, but they were final in a way that hurt more than cruelty would have. "I made a mistake," Elena said quietly. "Maybe," Julian said, "but it wasn't mine to fix. It was never really about the money, Elena. It was about what you decided I was worth before you had all the facts. That's not something a bank transfer changes." He ended the call gently, without anger, and Elena stood alone in the penthouse that suddenly felt enormous and cold, staring out at a skyline that no longer looked like proof of anything except how easily certainty could be built on sand. 6 months later, Kane Global Industries had stabilized under its new board structure. Victor Kane remained CEO in title, though everyone in the financial world understood the real decisions now flowed through Meridian Holdings representatives on the board. His name still hung on the building. His office still had the view. But the empire he'd built on leverage and appearances now ran on someone else's discipline. Julian rarely thought about it anymore. Once the restructuring closed, Meridian's involvement became exactly what it had always been designed to be from the start: a quiet, profitable position among dozens of others in a diversified portfolio. He'd gotten what the numbers required. Anything beyond that had never been the point, or so he told himself, most days successfully. He still lived in the same modest apartment, still made his coffee in the chipped mug that had somehow survived every attempt he'd made to replace it with something nicer. Some habits, he found, were harder to correct than balance sheets. Priya found him one evening reviewing a new investment prospectus, the city dark outside his window. "Word is Elena Voss moved back to her hometown," she said carefully, watching for his reaction. "Left Kane Global's social circle completely. Word is the two of them ended things not long after the restructuring closed." Julian didn't look up from the prospectus. "That's not really our business anymore, is it?" "No," Priya agreed. "I just thought you'd want to know." Julian set down his pen and, for a moment, allowed himself to think about the rooftop, the ring, the version of himself who had knelt down believing that love required no proof beyond honesty. That version of him hadn't disappeared, exactly, He'd simply learned at considerable cost that some people needed proof before they could recognize what was standing in front of them, and that needing proof wasn't necessarily a flaw in someone else's character. Sometimes it was just an honest limitation Julian would have to accept, whether or not it had ever been fair to him. Do you regret it? Priya asked. Any of it? Julian considered the question seriously, the way he considered every serious question. I regret that it happened, he said finally. I don't regret how I responded to it. There's a difference. Priya nodded, satisfied, and left him alone with the city lights and the quiet hum of a business empire he'd built entirely out of sight, a fortune nobody outside a small circle even knew existed, and a heart he'd learned to protect the same careful, patient way he protected every other asset that mattered to him. Outside his window, Kane Towers still glowed gold against the night sky, a monument to a man who had mistaken volume for value. Julian's own building had no name on it at all. He preferred it that way. He always had. Some victories, he'd come to understand, were louder when nobody was watching them happen at all.